nuclear talks with Iran and a long road to go. The deal reached yesterday is only a preliminary framework, even as it sparked celebrations in the streets of Tehran. Some say the deal will limit Iran's ability to build an atomic bomb. Others warn it will spark a nuclear arms race in one of the world's most volatile regions, the Middle East. John Bolton is the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, also a Fox News contributor. Based on reading what you've written, I would count you in that latter camp. You think that this is a bad deal that's going to spark an arms race in the Middle East?
Yeah, in fact, I think the past 2 years of negotiations have convinced governments like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and perhaps others that the United States is not going to do what's necessary to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And so the nuclear arms race isn't going to wait until Iran detonates its first nuclear test device. The nuclear arms race has already begun.
But what about all of this talk out of the administration saying, oh, we have really dismantled or prevented the Iranians from getting a bomb here?
Well, it's wrong in almost every particular, but let's start with the even more fundamental point. What deal do they have? If you look at all the statements that were issued yesterday, precisely one of them was a joint statement between the European Union and Iran. Everything else was unilateral. The administration issued a fact sheet with a lot of specifics on it. Where was Iran's signature on that fact sheet? That's the administration's characterization of what they think was agreed. And I'll tell you something, in an international negotiation, if you can't reach an agreement in principle sufficiently clear that the parties can sign their names to it, you don't have an agreement in principle. I think this is all still up in the air, and I think the Iranians have a sense that they're going to get even more concessions from the administration. You know, by the administration's own metrics, by the statements the president and others have made over the past several years, this is well below what they themselves said was the minimal acceptable.
Josh Earnest, the president's spokesman, was on this morning with Bill Hemmer, and again, crowing about the strength of this deal. Here's what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction.
This is the most intrusive inspections of any country's nuclear program that have ever been put in place against a country. So what we're talking about are the toughest inspections that have ever been put in place. So it's not just their nuclear facilities that are subject to inspection. It's also reprocessing facilities for nuclear material. It's uranium mines inside of Iran that are subject to inspection. It's weapons facilities that are subject to inspection. It's the manufacturing facilities.
He said what we are talking about, and we are still talking about it because it's a framework for an agreement. It's not an actual agreement, but let's just say the administration gets an agreement to all of that. What do you make of?
Well, number one, it's not the most intrusive agreement, even by their statement. But the fact is that the Iranians have successfully stiffed the International Atomic Energy Agency for decades. And there is no reason to think that they won't do it again. I think when we finally sign a deal, if we do, it's not the end of the process. It's just a rest stop between the last 2 years of negotiations, or maybe even the last 12 years of negotiations, and the next phase. But let me just pick one specific thing that he said, that we will have access to Iran's military facilities. Forget about it. Forget about it. The Iranians have consistently said they're not going to let the IAEA in, and I don't think there's any indication in anything they've said that they've changed their mind on that. That changes, it would be a big deal. There's no evidence it has. So he's just making things up.
The president even said yesterday the Iranians will be allowed to continue their heavy water reactor. What do you need a heavy water reactor for if you're not running a nuclear weapons program?
Yeah, and on that point, the fact sheet from the White House says that the redesigned Iraq heavy water reactor will not produce weapons-grade plutonium. Now, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but it's my understanding that any fissile reaction of uranium in a controlled environment like a reactor produces plutonium that's weapons-grade, plutonium-239. You can have more or less of it. You can have heavy versus light water reactors, but it produces weapons-type plutonium. So I'd like an explanation from the State Department. How exactly are they going to avoid that? And by the way, is there any other reactor like that in operation in the world today?
Good question. A quick couple of tweets from the Ayatollah Khamenei. He said, U.S. sanctions are ineffective. Threatening to sanction or military action won't scare Iranians. God backs Iranian nation's resistance. And then he also tweeted this out. After saying that sanctions are ineffective, he says, "We reject U.S. fraudulent offer of reaching a deal with Iran first, then lifting sanctions. Lifting sanctions is part of a deal, not its outcome." He sounds like a guy who really wants the sanctions lifted. So which is it there?
Well, I think there's still fundamental division between Iran and the others over when and under what circumstances the sanctions get lifted. And let's be clear, the administration itself has said repeatedly that the negotiations are taking place under the general rubric, nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to. So again, all of these specifics that the White House has put out get swept away if Iran isn't satisfied on lifting the sanctions, which, by the way, are shot through with holes. They've been evaded very successfully. And the regime itself, the sanctions regime, is crumbling in front of us as businesses around the world say it will end formally. We're going to get into the Iranian market first.
Last question, or it's really a request for a prediction. What happens June 30th when this deal is supposed to be finalized?
I think there will be a deal signed. I think the Iranians have one very clear objective: sign this deal during the Obama administration. God knows who will be elected to succeed him, but it's hard to imagine anybody who's a weaker, worse negotiator than this president.
Ambassador John Bolton, a Fox News contributor.